Welcome to Sola Church Online.
I'm Alan Rigg. This is my wife, Miranda Landers, and together we lead Sola Church, a life-giving church in Santa Monica, California.
We meet in person on Sundays at 10 a.m. at Olympic High School. The location is 721 Ocean Park Boulevard.
And we pre-record parts of our service to share with you on the Church Online platform, on Facebook, and on YouTube.
And today is Father's Day, so happy Father's Day, babe. We want to wish all the dads out there a very special day.
We're so thankful for our dads. And thankful, too, for all the men who are making a difference in our lives. We're thankful for those who have been spiritual fathers, fathers in the faith. Thankful for men who participate in things like, Big Brother type programs where they mentor others. I'm grateful for men who are good men who love God and who are like Christ and who are loving and strong but gentle and who have blessed our lives. So just a shout out to the men who are making a difference.
And we've got a great service planned. But first, let's worship.
Blessed be your name when I'm found in the desert place. Though I walk through the wilderness, blessed be your name. And every blessing you pour out, I'll turn back to praise. When the darkness closes in, Lord, still I will say, blessed be the name of the Lord. Blessed be your name. Blessed be the name of the Lord. Blessed be your glorious name. Blessed be your name when the sun's shining down on me, when the world's all as it should be. Blessed be your Blessed be your name on the road marked with suffering. Though there's pain in the offering, blessed be your name. Every blessing you pour out, I turn back to praise. When the darkness closes in, Lord, still I will say, blessed be the name of the Lord. Blessed be your name. Blessed be the name of the Lord. Blessed be your glorious name. Give and take away. You give and take away. My heart will choose to say, Lord, blessed be your name. Every blessing you pour out, I turn back to praise. When the darkness closes in, Lord, still I will say, blessed be the name of the Lord. Blessed be your name. Blessed be the name of the Lord. Blessed be your glorious name. Blessed be the name of the Lord. Blessed be your name. Blessed be the name of the Lord. Blessed be your glorious name. Give and take away. Give and take away. Heart will choose to say, Lord, blessed be your name. affections are for me. And oh, how he loves us. Oh, how he loves us. How he loves us. Oh.
This is that time in our service when we worship with our giving. If you're just checking us out today, please don't feel obligated to give. But if Sola Church is your church home, or if you just want to help us accomplish our mission to be a life-giving church in Santa Monica, it's super easy to make a one-time tax-deductible donation or even to reschedule a recurring gift.
The easiest way is to look for the link in your chat feed. But you can also go to solachurch.life and look for the button at the top that says Give.
So take advantage of this opportunity while people are doing that to just talk about our relocation. We launched our church at Olympic High School. We signed a contract that went through their academic year that takes us through the end of June. And so we're looking at a move in July. And we're looking at moving to Jocelyn Park here in Santa Monica. In fact, it's just a few short blocks from Olympic High School. but they have a beautiful auditorium and also classroom space for the kids there at that park. So we're working with the city to determine exactly when that space is going to be available for us. That means you've got to stay posted. If you're local and sometimes attend in person, you've got to really stay posted over these next couple of weeks to find out for sure what will be our last Sunday at Olympic and what might be our first Sunday at Jocelyn. So we'll definitely keep you posted.
Let's get into our time of teaching.
So there are more than 2,500 questions in the Bible. Sometimes people ask questions about God. That's not weird at all, right? Like we've all got questions about God. Sometimes people ask God questions. That's not weird either, because we all have questions that we'd like to ask God if we could. And then other times God asked people questions. Now that, when you think about it, is weird. Like if you know everything, can you learn anything? And yet on the pages of the Bible, we see God asking Adam, "Where are you?" God asking Cain, "Where is Abel, your brother?" God asking Moses, "What is that in your hand?" God asking Isaiah, "Whom shall I send?" God asking Jeremiah, "Is there anything too hard for me?" God, He does know everything. He can't learn anything, but He wants us to learn something. Ken Geyer wrote, "The important questions are not the ones we ask God, but the ones He asks us." Let's turn to Mark chapter 6. This message is part of a message series called Convergence. It's a verse-by-verse study through the gospel according to Mark. Convergence, well, that's what we call it when two or more things come together. Here on the pages of Mark's gospel, we see God come together with man. The same thing happens in this online space. My title today is Questions. There are several questions that we're going to find in our text. The first of those, let's call it the ownership question. We're going to look at a text we looked at last fall. Actually, we were in a different account of this same story. We're going to look at it from a little bit different angle. So beginning in verse 30, it says, "Then the apostles gathered to Jesus and told him all things, both what they had done and what they had taught. And he said to them, 'Come aside by yourselves to a deserted place and rest a while.' For there were many coming and going, and they did not even have time to eat." So, beginning in verse 7, Jesus had sent his disciples out, the 12 apostles, 2 by 2 on a short-term missions trip, as it were. And so they had planned this rendezvous where they were to give a report on how things had gone and what had happened, but they weren't able to do it. There were so many people, there were so many needs. They didn't even have time to eat in verse 31. You notice the word eat in verse 31, but also the word eaten in verse 44. So they would eventually eat. And Jesus would actually feed many thousands of people in the story that we're going to look at. But it's funny that Jesus is like, yeah, no, we're going to eat. I mean, if we have to get off by ourselves to eat, we're going to eat. If we have to feed thousands of other people to eat, we're going to eat. I love Jesus for that. Gordon MacDonald, in his book, Renewing Your Spiritual Passion, said, "Doing more for God may mean less time with God." That's true. That's a challenge. That's a challenging thing. Have you heard of what they call speed smear? Speed smear is when you're driving, and as your speed increases, objects in your peripheral vision become blurred and distorted. So when you're sitting at a traffic signal, you've got lots of peripheral vision. But when the light turns green and you begin to accelerate, you slowly lose that peripheral vision until, if you get going fast enough, all you've got is what we sometimes call tunnel vision. That happens in our lives too. The disciples, they were physically weak, they needed to eat, and they were emotionally fragile. You could argue that they were, grieving the news about John the Baptist, whose death we read about last week. And that's why Jesus said, "Come aside." Or as it says in the King James Version, "come apart." Vance Havner said, "If we don't come apart and rest, we'll just come apart." I think he was right about that. In verse 32, it says, "So they departed to a deserted place in a boat by themselves. But the multitude saw them departing, and many knew him and ran there on foot from all the cities. they arrived before them and came together to him. So in John's account, John 6, that's the account we looked at in the fall, it tells us that Passover was near. Passover is one of 3 major Jewish feasts. And so Jews that would come from throughout the Roman Empire. And that explains the larger than normal crowd. We're not talking about hundreds, but as it notes in verse 44, we're talking about thousands of people. And the people that ran in verse 33, they ran like 10 miles. I mean, this was 4 miles by sea. It was 10 miles by land. So, whereas Jesus is crossing the lake, these people are having to sort of go around a part of the lake. 10 miles, I mean, that's not quite a half marathon, but it's pushing a half marathon. It must have been humorous and also maybe, a little bit disappointing or frustrating to the disciples when they got to the shore and there were all the same faces that were on the shore when they left. Well, verse 34, Jesus, when he came out, saw a great multitude and was moved with compassion for them because they were like sheep, not having a shepherd. So he began to teach them many things. You notice how it says that he was moved with compassion. That's something we need more of. Richard Carlson, in his book, Don't Sweat the Small Stuff, said that compassion is a sympathetic feeling. It involves the willingness to put yourself in someone else's shoes, to take the focus off yourself. It's the recognition that other people's problems are every bit as real as our own, often far worse. In recognizing this fact and trying to offer some assistance, we open our own hearts. Jesus wants us to be compassionate too. And this brings us to Jesus' first question. This is the only miracle that's recorded in all 4 Gospels. And so Jesus' first question is actually found in John's account. In John 6, verses 5 and 6, I'll just read it to you. It says, "Then Jesus lifted up his eyes, and seeing a great multitude coming toward him, he said to Philip, 'Where shall we buy bread that these may eat?' But this he said to test him, for he himself knew what he would do." Now, they were near Bethsaida. Luke tells us that. Bethsaida was Philip's hometown, as well as a couple other of the disciples. But that's why Jesus asked Philip. Made sense to ask a local. And again, it says that he asked him to test him. You guys know that I'm not a huge fan of tests. I've joked before about how I hate fill-in-the-blank tests and matching tests and multiple choice tests and ordering tests and short answer tests and true-false tests and yes-no tests. They're so not fun. But remember that Jesus, he doesn't ask questions so that he can learn something about us, but so that we can learn something about ourselves. He was trying to get Philip's buy-in. I called this the ownership question. He wanted Philip and the rest to take ownership of the problem, of their shared mission to touch people's lives. And so in Mark, verse 35, it says, "When the day was now far spent, his disciples came to him and said, 'This is a deserted place, and already the hour is late. Send them away that they may go into the surrounding country and villages and buy themselves bread, for they have nothing to eat.'" This is probably several hours later, and you notice that the disciples just want to send the people away. In other words, they didn't want to solve the problem, they just wanted to get rid of it. I said when we looked at the passage in John in the fall that these guys are masters of the obvious. Like, all the things they point out are true, but it was so unnecessary. Like, this is a deserted place. Really? Is that why it looks deserted? The hour is late. Really? Is that why the sun is nearing the horizon? They have nothing to eat. Really? Is that why everyone's stomach is growling? Like, master of the obvious, just not helpful. We even compared them to the SNL character Debbie Downer, just, seeing like the dark side of everything. This does happen with regard to our shared mission. I'm talking about just a local church, any community of faith. This can happen. There are people who want to have control without responsibility. It's a lot of fun to, be able to decide things and, lead things and so forth. But there are very few people who really want to roll up their sleeves and do the hard work and be responsible for those things. And churches, just like workplaces and just like government and just like our homes, you've got the easy job and the hard job. Anyone can put their finger on the problem, but not everyone will lift a finger to be part of the solution. So how is it for you? Are you the one that puts your finger on problems, or are you the one who will lift a finger to be part of the solution? I think this is what it means to have ownership. To have ownership is not to be the one that points out the problems, but to be the one that lifts fingers to help solve them. Are you that person? Like, obviously, Sola Church and any local church is God's church, but there's also a sense in which it's our church, a sense in which it's your church. I'm talking about each one of us having a sense of ownership. Do we have ownership? So questions, the ownership question. Do we own the shared mission of our faith community, of our local church, in this case of Sola Church? Next comes the stewardship question. So verse 38. But he answered and said to them, you give them something to eat. And they said to him, shall we go and buy 200 denarii worth of bread and give them something to eat? But he said to them, how many loaves do you have? Go and see. And when they found out, they said 5 and 2 fish. Well, I want you to notice the giving words in these verses. We have the words give and gave 3 times. In verse 37a, you could underline you give. In verse 37b, you could underline the elliptical phrase, shall we give? And in verse 41, you could underline the elliptical phrase, he gave. You see a theme? Jesus' second question there in verse 38 is a stewardship question. The Bible has so much to say about stewardship. It's been said that like 1/6 of the Gospels deals with stewardship, and 1/3 of the parables address the subject of stewardship in some way, shape, or form. You know, as we study the Bible, Old Testament and New, we come to understand how for us as followers of Christ, God is our financial planner. And one way to think about his financial plan for our lives is simply this, that when we receive income, the first thing we do is give. Most of us give to our local church. The next thing we do is share. That might be with other, nonprofits, with family members or friends with needs. And then we enjoy the rest, including, hopefully, saving some for future enjoyment. Give, share, enjoy. Now, with that in mind, a denarius was a day's wage. So they were estimating that it was going to take 200 denarii to buy enough food to feed the many thousands of people who were present. We're talking about 8 months' pay. I mean, just think in your own mind, like what 2/3 of your annual income would be. That's about how much money Philip was guessing it would take to buy enough food. So we do know that Philip was the speaker. John tells us that. And Philip is basically saying, Jesus, what you're suggesting is not possible. Listen to verse 37 in the New Living Translation. Jesus said, you feed them. With what, they asked? It would take a small fortune to buy food for all this crowd. So again, it's not possible. But they were also suggesting that it wasn't worth it. Listen to that 37th verse one more time. This time in the Message, Jesus said, you do it. Fix supper for them. And they replied, are you serious? You want us to go spend a fortune on food for their supper? So the suggestion is that it's not possible, but even if it were, it's not worth it. Well, Ron Blue says that stewardship is the use of God-given resources for the accomplishment of God-given goals. You know, some followers of Christ tithe. They give 1/10 of their income. And to some that sounds crazy, but to others it seems totally reasonable. Imagine if I approached you with 10 $100 bills and I said, I'm going to give you 10 $100 bills and you're going to give me one back and you keep 9. We would think that was like the greatest deal ever. As a parent, surely at some point you've had your child, maybe your kids are not children now, but when they were, at some point you've probably been at the theater with children, with your children or your grandchildren or someone else's children. And, you paid for a box of candy and you gave it to them. And about halfway through the movie, you're thinking, one of those Milk Duds sounds really good right now. And maybe you ask for a Milk Dud and they're like, no. Have you ever had a kid tell you no? You're like, I bought that box of Milk Duds. Like, are you serious? Give me a Milk Dud. But we could be like that with God, There's kind of this mentality that we have in our culture of get all you can all you get, sit in the can. Someone even said poison the rest. Oh my.
Are we tight-fisted or are we open-handed? You know, I've throughout decades of following Christ and attending church services, I've certainly sat through messages about giving, and this isn't even that. That's just a small part of this message. But sometimes in those messages, you'll hear this passage from Malachi quoted. In Malachi 3, verse 10, it says, "Bring all the tithes into the storehouse, that there may be food in my house. And try me now in this, says the Lord of hosts, if I will not open for you the windows of heaven and pour out for you such blessing that there will not be room enough to receive it." And the idea behind a verse like that is not at all that we would ever give to get, but the idea is that we would give without fear, because we would give to a God who we know has got us. God's got us. And as we follow his plan for us in this area of stewardship, we can totally trust him. He's worthy of our trust. So again, in the passage in John, it says that one of his disciples, Andrew, Simon's Peter brother, said to him, "There is a lad who has 5 barley loaves and 2 small fish, but what are they among so many?" So the thing is, I mean, what we're talking about, remember there are thousands of people here. We're talking about the loaves are not loaves. They're like, not the way we think about loaves. What this means is these small flat wafers. And the fish, well, again, we're not talking about, you know, like a salmon. We're talking about small pickled fish. You know, what the only food they found in this crowd of thousands was one boy's lunch, the equivalent of an Oscar Mayer Lunchable or a Happy Meal. Well, I don't know how it was for this kid. I don't know how he felt, you know. Maybe when you were a kid, you know, you had the bully at school take your lunch money. I don't think this kid felt that way. I think this kid was a hero. I think this kid was willing to share. I think that's a beautiful picture. But Jesus wasn't asking them for 2/3 of their annual salary. They couldn't do that. He was asking for lunch money. They could do that. And I think it's so helpful to remember that God doesn't ask us to give what we can't. He only asks us to give what we can. So just like the question of, you know, will we take ownership? Well, we also have to ask ourselves, will we practice stewardship? There's the ownership question. Will we take ownership of our shared mission? There's the stewardship question. You know, will we participate financially? Will we be stewards of those resources that God has entrusted to us, you know, as it relates to this shared mission? And then finally, there's the leadership question. So verse 39, "Then he commanded them to make them all sit down in groups on the green grass. So they sat down in ranks, in hundreds and in 50s. And when he had taken the 5 loaves and the 2 fish, he looked up to heaven, blessed and broke the loaves, and gave them to his disciples to set before them. And the 2 fish he divided among them all. So they all ate and were filled, and they took up 12 baskets full of fragments and of the fish." Now those who had eaten the loaves were about 5,000 men. So there were likely a comparable number of women. And then there were also children. So we're talking about, you know, many thousands of people. I compared it before to maybe passing the Staples Center in Los Angeles right as the Lakers game ends and seeing a sold out crowd spilling into the street. That would give us some idea the size of the crowd. Well, this brings us to Jesus' third question, which really is not a question at all. It's a command. Jesus gave them a series of commands. This was all about his leadership. That's why I called this the leadership question. I imagine as Jesus gave them step-by-step instructions as to what they were to do as they lived out their shared mission, that silence must have fallen on the crowd. Philip Yancey has pointed out that we read Jesus' life backwards. In other words, we already know what happened. You know, unless you are reading this story for the first time, and if you are, congratulations. I think that's awesome, man. You've got so many amazing discoveries to make as you read the Bible. But for most of us, we begin reading this story. We've read it many, many, many times. There's no drama. There's no suspense for us. We know already what happens, but no one present knew. No one there knew what was going to happen with that Lunchable. Jesus would have prayed. Alfred Edersheim suggests a prayer like, "Blessed art thou, Jehovah, our God, King of the world, who causes to come forth bread from the earth." And then in verse 41, when he had taken the 5 loaves and the 2 fish, he looked up to heaven, blessed and broke the loaves, something like I just said, and gave them to his disciples to set before them. And the 2 fish he divided among them all. Now, the Greek verb translated gave in verse 41 is in the imperfect tense, which means that he gave, and he gave, and he gave, and he kept giving. The point is that the miracle, the multiplication, the miracle took place in his hands, not in theirs. Whatever we give, God can multiply. I mean, that's part of the beauty of it. You know, when we do what we can with what we've got, God takes that and he multiplies it so many times over. I love the idea that we're not manufacturers, we're just distributors. God's the one who manufactures in the sense that, you know, he's the one that performs the miracle. He's the one that provides us with what we have. He's the one that multiplies what we have. Our only role is to distribute. You know, this is our role in the shared mission. We're just doing what he's called us to do. We do but a little with a lot. God does a lot with but a little. So many times in the Bible, God used whatever a person had in their hand in his service. You know, we think about what was in Moses' hand, a rod. And God used Moses and that rod to lead the Exodus, you know, when millions of Jewish slaves were freed from Egypt. We think of Shamgar in the Old Testament. He had an ox goad in his hand. And God used Shamgar and that ox goad to kill 600 Philistines, 600, you know, enemy combatants. Same with Samson. What did Samson have in his hand? Samson in the Old Testament, he had the jawbone of a donkey in his hand. God used Samson and that jawbone to kill 1,000 Philistines, 1,000 enemy combatants. What did David have in his hand? David had a sling. God used David in that sling to take down Goliath. Think about the widow of Zarephath. What did she have in her hand? All she had was some flour and some oil, and God used that to provide not only for her, but for Elijah. We think about Dorcas in the New Testament. What did Dorcas have in her hand? She had a needle. And God used Dorcas and that needle to provide clothing for widows. We think about this boy. What did this boy have in his hand? He had a brown bag lunch. He had a Lunchable. He had a Happy Meal. And God used it to feed many thousands of people. What's in your hand? I'm talking about every part of your life, like not just finances, like we talked about stewardship in the previous point, but I'm talking about, you know, what are those things that God has given you, even in terms of, you know, talents and gifts and abilities and experiences and influence and a platform and all of these kinds of things. Like what is in your hand, and have you given it back to God? In John 6, the version in John 6, the account there, everyone said afterwards, when they saw what Jesus did, this is truly the prophet who is to come into the world. Like, they realized he's all that. And we realize he's all that. And as we realize he's all that, well, will we follow his leadership? The ownership question. Will we take ownership of our shared mission? The stewardship question. Will we practice stewardship as it relates to our shared mission? The leadership question. Will we follow his leadership with regard to our shared mission? Father, thank you for this Bible story, and thank you that, you know, you are at work in this world. And we get to be part of that, not just individually, though that's true, but as a community, a faith community, a local church, a Sola church. And Father, I pray that, you know, every person that attends this weekend in person and every person that attends this weekend online, every person that watches this service going forward, I pray, Lord, that we could really step into all of these things, that we could ask ourselves as you ask us about ownership and stewardship and leadership. And I pray, Lord, that we would choose to take ownership of the shared mission of Sola Church. That we would choose to practice stewardship when it comes to the shared mission of Sola Church. That we would choose to follow your leadership when it comes to this shared mission of Sola Church. Lord, one among many, seeking to be a part of what you're doing here on the west side of Los Angeles and across the country and around the world. Thank you, Lord, for letting us be a part of that. In Jesus' name, amen.
We hope you enjoyed this online service. And to learn more about Sola Church, you can go to solachurch.life.
Yeah, and be sure to connect with us on social media. You can subscribe on YouTube, but also look for @SolaChurchLA on Facebook, Instagram, and Twitter.
And we hope you all have a wonderful week, and we will see you next time at Sola Church Online.
Bye, everybody. Enjoy your Father's Day.